I feel like a lot of leaders, just your rank and file employees, are kind of caught on two horns of the dilemma. On the one hand, I need to be doing more with this technology because if I don't, I'm going to fall behind or I'm going to lose some kind of advantage or I'll get out competed or out innovated. There's just even sort of innate or kind of tacit sense that there's something like some sort of like fear of missing out. But then on the other side, there's the fear of, if I use this, does this make me look less valuable? Does this make me obsolete? Is this cheating, quote unquote? So there's really it's interesting to look at what the literature talks about. There's technology related anxiety, and then there's this sense of a loss of occupational identity. And these two things, we're kind of wrestling with both of these, right?
What if the biggest challenge with AI in the workplace isn't the technology, but the uncertainty it creates about who we are and how we contribute? Welcome to the Science for Work podcast, where we explore evidence-based insights from IO psychology and HR management to help make work better. I'm your host, Matt Lampe. As AI becomes less of a future concept and more of a present expectation, a different kind of pressure is showing up. It's not just about learning new tools, it's about facing real uncertainty around our roles, our relevance, and what's expected of us in a system that's still shifting beneath our feet. In this episode, we're joined by two guests who bring deep experience at the intersection of psychology, technology, and organizational life. Josh Prasad and Neil Morelli are both organizational psychologists who think deeply about how people and systems evolve and how we make sense of our work in the middle of change. We talk about how AI is reshaping expectations, from how leaders make decisions to how people make sense of their roles. We cover the unspoken fears, the pressure to act before understanding, and what it looks like to build responsibly in the middle of all of that. If you enjoy this episode, consider sharing it with a colleague, leaving a review, or subscribing to hear more conversations like this one. You can also visit ScienceForWork.com to learn more or to get involved. Josh Prasad and Neil Morelli, welcome to the Science for Work podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Matt. It's
Thanks
good to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
absolutely. So what brought us together for this episode, and then even before that, was the two of you were putting together a learning course around AI and employee listening, and it was something that really kind of caught my attention because it didn't seem like it was just about how organizations are doing annual surveys. It was really about how technology can make listening more of a continuous and a cultural practice, how AI features can really enhance the way that organizations are connecting employee listening and feedback and engagement to overall bigger questions around workforce strategy. Before we get into any of that, though, if you want to take a moment, tell us a little bit about each of you and the work that you do. Josh, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Colorado State University, and I also do some light consulting work around AI, largely small group training around using AI for sort of HR and IO psychology related consulting firms. Some of my research, I've recently been funded by the National Science Foundation to use generative AI to study the experience of students in STEM. So yeah, I've been kind of interested in selection, machine learning, AI for quite some time. And then obviously, as we've all been kind of hit by the ChatGPT moment, I've just been kind of trying to double down. So yes, it's a bit about me.
Awesome. Neil, how about you?
Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm like Josh. I'm also organizational psychologist and was formerly the chief science officer, the chief IO at Codility, which is a technical skills assessment platform. I've worked for other technical skills and psychometric skills testing and assessment companies, different technology startups. I've just been in this sort of intersection of technology and IO for probably about 15 years or so. Um, Initially got started looking at mobile testing and how mobile tests might change the nature of what we're looking at and how we're doing measurement. So I've just always been at this kind of cool, meeting point of technology and IO. But the past couple of years, as Josh was saying, getting into ChatGPT and studying what that means for software engineers primarily, and looking at all the skills that are rapidly changing and new skills that are coming on the scene, just gave me a really great appreciation for this moment in time. And that led me to launch my own company called Workplace Labs. And we do technology adoption, support, and advisement. And the main way we do that today is through training HR folks on how to use generative AI tools, how to integrate it into their work. So I've been working with a lot of different folks on different use cases and helping them upskill and just get prepared for this new sort of modern era of being AI enabled, which is pretty cool.
I love that. AI enabled. It's clearly not just about limiting to certain tools or different tactics. It's really about the shift that's happening that you're both seeing and contributing to, the shift in HR and organizational psychology as AI becomes a part of everyday work. The opportunities, the challenges, just the human reactions and human nature that's involved, that I'm excited to explore this and jump into this a little bit. So to kind of start with a starting point, where are you seeing, or what are you seeing right now with AI adoption and HR and workforce planning? Like, you both kind of mentioned that some of the generative AI tools, ChatGPT, things like that, rolled out a few years ago. What are you seeing as far as how companies are adopting AI, how they're integrating it? Is it something that's still on a trial basis? Like, what's your perspective on how that's going?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I'm going to guess, Neil, that you've seen something similar, but it seems like there's kind of a gap between the recognition to act, or the need to act, but then there's a gap between that recognition and like tactically implementing some sort of change in the workplace. So whether that change is recognizing what technology that needs to be adopted, training, etc. So I think probably the most salient thing that I've seen is just this like gap between needs recognition and actually choosing an action to adopt or enable AI. But I'll be curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, from what I'm seeing, everyone's using generative AI and no one's using generative AI. And what I mean by that is we're all using it on a daily basis. I think you've seen figures of 80 to 90% people are trying this out. They're using it in light ways. I almost included this as sort of the headline of our website, but the idea is we want people to go beyond using it to write their emails. And, that is like the number one use case that I hear most people saying, hey, I would love to get some help writing this email or reformatting it or something like that. But how do we use it more systematically, actually see the return on investment of using it? How do we do more sophisticated things? And that's what I mean by no one's really using its full potential today. But there are folks that are trying to figure that out. There are individuals that are doing this, and they're doing it without, I would say, a lot of support from their organizations. The training support and resources is still pretty low. I know more and more people are having access to prompt engineering courses and other types of workshops and overviews, sometimes being hosted or offered internally. But making sure that in a very relevant, specific way how to apply it to your job, people are still just scratching the surface there. I mean, the good news is that there are more teams that are trying to figure this out together, and I'm just going to be really curious to see how that goes forward. As we're going to be incorporating it into our work more and more, but people just need help doing that.
So are you seeing it more in like organizations are implementing this or trying this and they're getting stuck somewhere, or sort of more of it's the wild, wild west? It's all open, it's open space, and there's not really clear direction. And so it's small steps this way, small steps that way. I mean, are people getting stuck with pilots or strategy alignment?
Gosh, it's. I think the confidence interval there is so wide. You have, I think, larger enterprises that are adopting and implementing generative AI within different work streams and different functions in a more intentional way, and they're doing pilots. I think you probably have heard and seen the latest MIT study that's going to go down in infamy about 95% of AI pilots failing. And from what I've just kind of anecdotally heard and people kind of commenting and responding to it, is that that number's probably pretty fair. Trying to get these AI projects out of the pilot phase is really difficult. But I think it's for some of the reasons that I just mentioned. I think people need more adoption support, more enablement, a better understanding of how to integrate it into their workflow. It's not just the technical challenges of, you know, getting your data out of silos and making sure everything's integrated, and having the right, scalability of certain systems, and having the right tools and the right sort of tech stack and vendors plugged in and operating. It's all of the other things that go into really understanding why, when, where, and how to use these tools. So I think there's not one single reason why people are getting stuck, but I do think we're in sort of this messy middle right now. We've moved beyond just the sort of initial exposure and the Wild West moment to more of a systematic approach, but really what works and in what context and in what settings for which companies. I think it's just a very broad range right now.
Yeah, and I'd just add that most of my experience is informed by smaller consultancies, but I assume this sort of experience is fairly ubiquitous. But there's the challenge of this general technology, like Neil's saying, like when and where are you using this thing? But then even if you can identify a use case, I was just working with a client where they're like, okay, we can maybe we can accelerate reporting with this, but is our client comfortable with us using their data in an AI tool? So like as you start thinking through actually getting out of pilot demonstration and into putting this in front of a client, like all of these other considerations come up, and then you get kind of stuck with, okay, well, this sounded kind of good, but now that the rubber's hitting the road, like maybe we're making clients uncomfortable. I had another person that I was talking to that was, concerned around, well, if we adopt a co-pilot to help answer initial questions from prospective clients, are we kind of diluting our brand because we want to be portrayed as experts and we hand it off to AI? Are we getting rid of that? So I think, yeah, there are all these other questions that come up as you get out of, can we show that AI can do something, to this is actually part of the service we offer. And I think all of these additional questions that kind of explode make it really tough to go beyond, as Neil was saying at the beginning, helping folks write email. There are these probably like low-lying tasks that are easy to implement and they go unnoticed, but then like the real organizational change, you run into a lot of these barriers, which, truth be told, I think they're worth contending with. I think that's where work is going, but it's a lot harder than just getting a ChatGPT subscription and custom play.
Yeah. That's interesting that you bring in the reservation around, or the hesitation around, if we implement this, how does it affect, or how it might it be perceived by our prospective customers, our prospective clients. And that brings to mind a paper that was published not too long ago about when you cite ChatGPT, or when you say this was written with AI, the level of trust diminishes and it goes down. People see that you acknowledge it, their confidence in you lowers, which kind of seems a little backwards to me, because you're being more honest, more transparent. But when you do that, all of a sudden people are going, I don't know about this. But so when you're talking with different leaders, different organizations, different practitioners, what are some of the reactions that you're hearing around AI adoption? We've kind of gotten into this a little bit, but what are some of their main concerns, not in addition to how is this perceived by prospective clients or current clients, but is there sort of a fear of being left behind, of if we put our data into this, who has access to it? Like, what are some of the reactions that you're hearing out there?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of leaders and in even ICs, individual contributors, and just your rank and file employees are kind of caught on two horns of a dilemma. I think they feel, on the one hand, I need to be doing more with this technology because if I don't, I'm going to fall behind, or I'm going to lose some kind of advantage, or I'll get out competed or out innovated. There's just even sort of innate or kind of tacit sense that there's something like some sort of like fear of missing out. But then on the other side, there's the fear of, like you were saying, if I use this, does this make me look less valuable? Does this make me obsolete? Is this cheating, quote unquote? So there's really, it's interesting to look at what the literature talks about. There's technology related anxiety, and then there's this sense of a loss of occupational identity. And these two things, we're kind of wrestling with both of these, right? We're kind of worried that maybe we're not going to be as competitive if we don't embrace this, or even if we do embrace this, what does that actually mean about us? And so I really think people maybe not are articulating it that way, but the literature's looked at this for years and years in different different technology transformations, and trying to understand what that means for this time. That's the challenge. And looking at some of the nuances of how AI is mimicking human behavior, it's mimicking human reasoning and language, just adds a whole other layer of complexity to all of this. Because now it's not just we have to learn the technical skills to use this platform or use these systems. It's embracing it almost as if you're embracing someone into the team, and you're hiring a new person, and all of the kind of the social emotional issues that come along with that. So, those are the two fears that I think people are trying to kind of navigate between.
Yeah, and I think it's reasonable to be have this like fear of missing out, but then also fear of occupational identity loss and anxiety around being replaced. Just because if you look at the headlines of either layoffs or hiring freezes among some of the larger tech companies, how much of that is going to spread? I mean, we saw kind of like a similar theme with the reduction in remote work starting at some of these larger companies, and then folks are asking, like, are these opportunities going to be less available? And it seems like with the larger companies, so to follow corporate America over some period of time. So I think the fears are warranted. However, it's a very interesting moment, just because like there's reason to both be afraid of missing out, but then also afraid of losing touch with what your work means. But then at the same time, all of these pilots are failing, as shown in the MIT studies. Like, it's a really, really turbulent moment to navigate. At least it seems like that, kind of as an outside observer of the situation. But yeah, I think certainly a lot of difficult to interpret aspects of the situation.
When you are, whether you're working with individuals and organizations through that process, or simply just looking at the research, are there studies or models that sort of stand out in explaining how this may be different than previous, or is this just a continuation of past technology advances? However many years ago there was this technology piece came in, and then before that was that. There's always going to be technology coming in. Is there any research, or are there studies or research or models that kind of stand out to you in terms of explaining that resistance, or that skill threat that you kind of talked about? Am I being replaced? And how are people moving past that hesitation into action?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and just from everything that I've read and just everything I've been exposed to so far, I don't see why AI is the type of technology transformation that's going to break the patterns that we've seen in the past. And we know that there's an adoption curve with new technologies. We know that people almost go through like a grief process when they embrace something new, and there's this reactance or resistance to change, and people have to kind of go through that at their own pace, and everyone kind of goes through it at different speeds. I don't see why AI is any different. in that regard. I just said that because it mimics how humans speak and think and behave in certain ways, I think it does add an additional layer of complexity to all of this, and maybe even an emotional component that we haven't seen before. But I still think I just haven't really seen any or heard any compelling reasons why AI is just going to completely break this whole AI adoption curve norm and trend that we've seen with others. Um, but one study that I found from 2014, actually, it was looking at this idea of occupational identity and technology transformation. Um, it was an Academy of Management, and it was looking at how librarians had adapted to the inclusion of internet searching and how they had kind of had to change their occupational identity. And so there was 22 years at that point of research and studies on how librarians in particular were adapting to internet searching. And the interesting thing was, at first they pushed back against it because the authors talked about this idea of the paradox of expertise, meaning the more familiar you are with a job function that is in threat of technological automation, the more you kind of try to distance yourself from it, and the less you kind of see sort of the upside or the possibilities of embracing the technology. It's your expertise, sort of like, I guess, the curse of knowledge. You see where all this could go wrong and why it's not as good, and all of this kind of stuff. But then over time, they noticed that, at least with librarians, they started to change their occupational identity from being, we are the masters and arbiters of finding the information that you need for you when you come into the library, and we'll point you in the right direction, to, we'll teach you how to use these tools. And then we are the connectors of people and information. So they tried to like elevate and look at these kind of higher order needs that people have, and sort of rephrase and conceptualize their occupational identity that incorporated the technology into it, and that eventually embraced it and said, okay, it's not us versus them. We've now kind of like threaded this through how we see ourselves in terms of like offering, like, what we do is who we are. So is that going to be, I think obviously we know the past is a pretty good predictor of the future. I don't see why we're now suddenly on some completely new technological ground in terms of like adoption and skill threat and all of that. So I think some kind of pattern will go forward. And just from my travel so far, I'm starting to see that a little bit on the HR side as well. When we're talking about digital labor, we're talking about higher order workforce planning, talent advisors, strategic talent advisors, and architects. And you see this in engineering as well. So, I think there's some initial examples of people reformulating their occupational identity, but we just need to help, as anyone working in HR or talent, we need to, first of all, be cognizant that that is the case and probably a need for people, and then help give them the tools to start to navigate that and go through that process themselves.
Yeah, and I think that example of librarians seeing themselves differently is a really concrete and nice one to put forward. In terms of ways to think about change, I think it's not necessarily a framework, but thinking about work tasks, I think, has been like a very salient topic, because I think when people talk about AI adoption, it can be abstract. It can be difficult to think about what to apply AI to, and whether it's a Stanford University business professor, Eric Bjorlifenson. Sorry, I totally messed that last name up. But, folks on the academic side point to tasks. People like Sam Altman and others say, AI is best applied to tasks. And I think it kind of resonates with some initial research that I saw coming out of Goldman Sachs in like 2023, where they were kind of trying to model how work would change, and they looked at different tasks and susceptibility to AI adoption. They found that like nearly all occupations have some tasks that can be modified or automated through AI, but very few occupations could be completely automated. And that conclusion, some folks on the academic side, my former advisor, Chris and I at Michigan State, and some collaborators, published a study about a year after that came to the same conclusion, where you can find lots of tasks that you can apply AI to, but very few occupations that just can be completely automated. And I think that's, rings true with that 2014 study that you just brought up, Neil, where, you know, you're not going to get rid of the librarian, but if some of the tasks are offloaded to a computer, then what remains is a different, or at least a slightly different occupation. So I think there's like a couple issues to, bear in mind. First is, folks are likely going to experience the need to be adaptable. Even with my own profession, I think we'll see increased support for parts of the research process. And, what does that mean for us as researchers? I think it's going to be less about grunt work and finding information and reading papers. And we're going to shift towards being prioritizing or being known for novel ideas and creativity. But, I think this issue of tasks and occupations changing also kind of partially explains what we're seeing with fear around job replacement. It's not necessarily that these jobs are going away, but, if coders, all of a sudden 20% of their original occupation can be offloaded to AI, then they can essentially expand their productivity by having offloaded that, chunk of their job. So then if organizations aren't considering, new ways to use their employees, then all of a sudden, you don't need the same headcount to get the same amount of work done. So I think they're like they go hand in hand, some of the fear around replacement, but then also the same conclusion that jobs aren't really going away yet. I think right now we're in this moment of we can figure out what tasks, through a lot of work, and we just talked about how change is tough, but we can offload some tasks to AI and make folks more productive, but we haven't quite figured out what to do with that latent productivity other than headcount reduction. So I'm looking forward to, a more creative use of those additional resources. And, among the smaller organizations that I work with, like none of them are talking about getting rid of folks just to save a buck, which is, happy for me to hear. But yeah, I think to get all the way back to your original question, I think like zeroing in on tasks is probably one of the most helpful things I've come across to making sense of all of this change with tech.
I like how there's elements of upskilling and also keeping into consideration, just a natural human behavior or adoption curve. I think you were talking about there's a sense of loss, sense of identity change, and then a sense of the role skill change as well, being able to implement that at the individual level and the organizational level. And, you can't always control the disruption, whatever it is that's this disrupting your work or your way of work, but there's opportunities to be able to control how you adopt to that, how you adapt to that, and the skill development that you do on an individual level, and then as an organization as well. I think I love hearing that. Yeah, some of the smaller firms, Josh, what you were talking about, they're not looking at headcount, reducing headcount. That's fantastic. And then when you look from a larger organization, these 1,000+ organizations, when they implement this and they have 20% of the work can be offloaded to technology, I love this notion of taking that librarian study, for example, and saying, all right, well, your day-to-day role, day-to-day tasks are going to change, and so it's almost one of those upskill, so that you're not. I've heard it said number of times, AI is not going to replace your job, but those who know how to use it might. And so that's where it's like, if you have that ability, hey, I can put 20% can go over here and be used by new technology. Here's what I'm doing now with my other 20% of my time, benefits to the organization.
Yeah.
I want to go. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's just occurring to me that there are different strategies and different sort of emphasis areas in helping people adapt that are sort of contextually dependent, whether you're younger. So we know entry-level jobs they've taken a hit. I think I just saw a 13% decrease in the amount of entry-level hiring recently. That it's a pretty stark break in terms of the type of hiring that you're seeing at more senior roles versus entry level. So younger I guess you could say like higher volume roles, maybe people with less education, I think they're more attuned and more concerned around this idea of job replacement and automation. And they need additional support in terms of upskilling, exposure to the tools so that they can embrace them for the jobs of the future, right? The jobs of the future that will be invented. But then the people that are more senior and I guess you could say more expert level, they need help in terms of redefining their occupational identity that incorporates the technology. So it's not, I think there is a level of upskilling that's needed, but it's more of an exposure to the capabilities of the tool and then creatively finding ways that it can help reconceptualize what you're doing as a reflection of who you are, so that I guess that internal sort of perception is protected and it's evolving. So it's kind of two different paths here, two different strategies.
At the start of our conversation, I mentioned one of the things that got us talking was the idea of a course around employee listening and HR AI. How are you seeing AI change the way that organizations can listen to employees? Can, when we talk about some of these fears or some of these concerns that people have in the workforce, how is AI part of that conversation where organizations, are they using that to be able to sort of locate and identify early on, here's some concerns and here's how we're going to be addressing these and here's how we're going to introduce upskilling, for example, just different ways. But overall, how is AI changing that landscape with employee listening?
Yeah, so I think listening is a great example of some of the kind of broader themes that we've been talking about in terms of like, how is the nature of work changing? Where are ways that AI can be specifically applied? I think one of the kind of more straightforward applications of AI with employee listening is, it would be great. And a lot of organizations are already moving past sort of the annual listening experience. But I think on the side of the employee listening professional, it'd be great if we can survey more and more frequently, but then there's the added challenge of like, the more often you survey, the more often you have to analyze data, put together decks, put together meeting agendas, all that sort of stuff. So there, alongside the added, labor on behalf of participants in surveys, the listening pros also, every time you survey, you have to do more behind the scenes work. So I think the low hanging fruit is having AI help you analyze data, whether it be writing code, if it's a fairly sophisticated data analysis process, but then also many of these tools, be it Tableau, Power BI, et cetera, they're just making it easier to go from data to some sort of conclusion. Another, I think perhaps one that showcases large language models specifically, in addition to kind of just this abstract making analyses go faster, I think folks are leveraging unstructured text data far more. So, I'd mentioned, I'm running the study trying to look at STEM students and their experiences. I think I'm seeing a very similar thing in the employee listening space, where whether it's products offered by large EX tools, like, so Qualtrics has advanced natural language processing now baked in, that's supported by large language models. If you want to talk about labor, if you have a bunch of open-ended questions about, what could we improve in the workplace, and you have a person read through all of them, you're quickly going to reach an organizational size where that's like no longer tractable. But with large language models, you can have it at least do an initial scan and actually make use of some of this data. We've got a buddy who's in a employee listening position at a Fortune 100 company, and he's also mentioned that in addition to internally collected data in the listening space, now they can take a look at Reddit posts about their company and Glassdoor posts and get, on the fly, what are people outside of our organization saying? So, I think the change with the position, you can see that a lot of the technical skills that characterize the occupation up until this point data analysis, putting together reports, et cetera. A lot of that can be offloaded to AI, or at least it's increasingly being offloaded to AI. So then there's these kind of two changes in the position. Like, what new forms of data can you take a look at? Be it open-ended comments at a greater volume, or Reddit posts. But then also, I think it kind of nudges folks in the occupation to perhaps address issues that weren't feasible in the past. So if I'm an employee listening professional and I'm spending all my time analyzing data, that's less time that I can be using towards managing change or building relationships with stakeholders. So I think we're going to see, I'm already, starting to consider it with one of the clients that I'm working with, but I think we'll see that that change with employee listening professionals, where sure, some of the nitty gritty tasks, they won't do as much, but then that opens them up for more value in sort of adjacent parts to their role. So I think, at a high level, that's what I'm seeing, but hopefully that helps answer the question.
Oh, absolutely. One of the thoughts that I have there, would be around relying too heavily on AI analysis. I've heard through different channels, there's a reservation, one, to input any organizational sensitive information into large language models. Part of that, maybe there's a fear of who owns that information, who has access to that information, is it proprietary? And so kind of balancing that, but then also the reliability and the validity of the output. I'm sure we can all think of a couple large examples, significant examples, where the output was not valid. It was not reliable. So when organizations are sort of balancing those risks or those blind spots, trying to bring this in to open up some of that capacity to interpret more information, more, whether it's survey feedback, Reddit data. I love that, scraping different various sources to really get more of a holistic picture. What standards or practices do you look for when judging evidence and quality in listening, and reliability and validity in what is produced as part of that output?
Yeah, I'm curious to see how this changes over time. So on the reliability, validity front, there's already some research to suggest that, if we take thematic analysis as an example, if you have humans rate a bunch of semi-structured interviews and AI rate the same interviews, you'll see about 80% overlap in the themes identified. So I think at present, anybody who's using large language models would likely have to accept that if you're only having LLMs analyze your text data, it's not going to be the same as what humans would do. So I think, there are a couple current reactions you could have to that. One being, perhaps you only use it for data that is just sitting unused, and you can at least make some use out of the data, even if it's imperfect relative to what a human would rate. Or a lot of folks, or at least on the research side I've seen, will sort of join forces with large language models. So, humans might rate a small subsample and come up with their own set of themes or own set of salient issues in the text. LLMs will do the same. And then you can see what the human output is versus the LLM output and say, this is the actual holistic picture of things that we want to take a look at in the text. And then you can, at least cover that 20% of themes or codes that an LLM would have missed. But the reason I somewhat hesitate is because we've also seen in the literature that, these metrics of how well LLMs are doing have just been rapidly improving. So, I can quote 80% at the moment, but check back in a year, it might be a little higher than that. There's also reason to believe that culturally specific information can be lost on large language models, things like sarcasm. I saw a study with interviews analyzed, I think it was among Japanese healthcare workers, and there are some specific aspects of culture that, large language models largely trained based on westernized text, we're not able to pick up on some of these themes. So, I think if folks find themselves in situations where, their employees are talking about a lot of, whether it be cross-cultural and from an international perspective, or, I feel like you could even find that domestically, perhaps you're working with a particular employee group that has their own way of speaking about things. These large language models might not capture what they're trying to say in quite the same way. So I think it's hard to say prescriptively without, seeing the data, how big of an issue these problems are. But I think it's worth keeping those issues to validity in mind, that it's probably worth throwing your data at an LLM and just seeing what happens. But there's going to be, particularly in high stakes situations, additional work needed to confirm that what you're seeing is valid and reliable. But then, I think on the front of data privacy, we're in this moment where a lot of these AI platforms are trying to convey that they are secure processors of your data, that they're not training on your data. I'm curious to see how that pans out in terms of, will the broader public accept that message, or is there still going to be fear around data privacy and whatnot? I also think on the actual hardware side, we might see more local large language models. So my cousin actually is in leadership consulting, and they, I was surprised, but kudos to them. But they're actually developing their own local deployment of a large language model. So when they have interviews with leadership, they can say, we're analyzing it using something like on-site. OpenAI will not see your data. And I think that I also would expect that to be easier to pull off in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just maybe two quick things to add to that is I do think the hallucination and I guess unreliability of the output is a technical problem to solve that I think people are on the trail of. There's a paper that just came out recently talking about hallucinations are a function of the way these models have been architected and then tuned and reinforced to not have any sort of I don't know type answers. And so when they start to re-engineer them saying that that type of answer is okay, there's a path there. I don't know all the architectural technical specifics of that, but I do think the hallucinations will become less and less of a problem over time. Will they ever be zero? No, just not the way the technology works. But that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, as people's AI literacy and our approach to layering these systems together instead of overly relying on any one instance or run of these models on a given data set or question, I think that then keeps us it gives us a better chance at making sure that they're consistent and trustworthy.
I could go a million different ways with some questions right now, because I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface, and so much of what each of you have said, Josh, some of what you were saying there, the word that was coming to mind is, when organizations have their own culture, whether it's language or patterns, whatever it might be, there's nuances that it's not always picked up by an LLM. And I am really intrigued by the idea of localizing that source. But I also want to be very mindful of time. You guys have shared, a tremendous amount of insight and information. And like I said, we could go on. I could keep asking a million questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. So as we sort of bring it to a close and wrap it up, looking ahead the next 12, 24 months, couple of years, what feels realistic in terms of AI adoption for HR, for organization, for employee listening? What do you see? It sounds like, and it feels like there's a lot of moving parts. Looking ahead for the next couple of years, what do you see is on the horizon? What are some areas that are of interest, of concern, or maybe even on the edge of being introduced or implemented?
I'll just share that I guess I have more of a bull case that people will find new ways to be creative in their work and innovate with these tools. That's where I really think the value lies, is not just in the efficiency gain, not just doing more with less or faster, It's thinking of new things that are possible, freeing up time for other type of work that we all care about. If you're in the HR, IO, talent management, development space, you want to have more of an impact on the working lives of employees and how the organization functions. I think I'll take the optimistic case here that I'm hopeful and looking forward to what people will be doing as we get more exposure and more adoption of these tools. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's also very possible that we just talk about AI or generative AI as a sort of monolithic technology less and less, similar to what we saw with the internet. There's lots of literature on unproctored internet testing, and we were specifically calling out that is the mediation technology that that's the channel, that's the medium. But it could be that we're just going to start focusing on the things that we all care about more, like supporting managers, like attracting and retaining talent, like adapting and adopting skills, incorporating. We're just going to start incorporating AI as a tool that helps us do all of these things in a more effective way, maybe more at scale, in more creative and innovative ways. And so it's less about adopting AI per se. It's more about accomplishing those goals and objectives, but we're going to be using AI along the process. So whether we'll see more and more talk about it, I don't know, but I think it's likely that we'll plateau. The phrase itself might start to become just kind of blended in with the other things that we're doing.
Yeah, and I actually my what to see next or what to be excited about is very similar. So I agree. I think like a lot of the applications of AI at the moment are around efficiency, and I think I'm more excited to see what do we do with that efficiency and what do we do with the capabilities of these large language models. So like with the employee listening example, like wouldn't it be great if we can tighten feedback loops? When participants share data, instead of waiting 2 weeks to hear back on, what them and their peers said, like what if it was tomorrow? I think that's going to be really exciting. And then if that part gets more efficient, maybe like we were talking about, maybe the employee listening pros can help support change. Maybe there can be more dialogue around some of the issues that are surfaced by these surveys. So I think I'm excited to see how occupations change in a positive way as this technology proliferates. I think a lot about one of the faculty that I worked with as a graduate student talking about conducting an exploratory factor analysis using punch cards, and like how my experience of stats is, or at least I don't envy him. So I'm hoping to see more of that, where it's like, okay, the experience of work highlights more of our creativity, our novelty, etc. But yeah, I mean, I think it remains to be seen. I think there's kind of a couple competing perspectives on where this tech will go. We see a lot of the tech CEOs saying, it's going to replace knowledge workers and work will become obsolete. Some of them say, we'll find new things to do. And I think there's probably a less vocal bunch that say large language models are going to be really helpful for some tasks, but just the way that they're designed, they can't replicate some things like truly new ideas and relationships, et cetera. Like they're going to be helpful task executors, but there's going to be plenty for us still to work on. And I think that last perspective is the one that I kind of consider is the most realistic. So hopefully, a lot of the grunt work gets handed off to the computer. The computer can do the work, and we get to focus on, I guess, more of the meaningful and interpersonally connected aspects of work. I think that's what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. I love it. There's so much potential, and the research that's being done in this area that you are both contributing to is just going to help bring a lot of that opportunity into reality. So where can people learn more about you, the type of work that you're doing, the courses that you're contemplating and coming up with? Where can people connect and learn more?
Yeah, people can learn more about how we're equipping HR folks with AI skills, intentional experimentation, identifying good use cases at aiforhrmastermind.com. and learn more there.
Yeah, and best place to find me would be on LinkedIn, whether it's just the general goings on, folks are interested in a small workshop. As soon as we have more to offer on this employee listening course that Neil and I are collaborating on, that'll be the place to hear about it.
Excellent. Josh, Neil, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing some incredible insights and your knowledge. Like I said, I could have asked a dozen more questions or more. This was a really great conversation. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for having us. This was great.
Thanks for listening to the Science for Work podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it or leaving a review. It might just be the opportunity that helps someone else discover evidence-based insights they can use in their work. For more research-backed resources, articles, and tools, or to get involved with the Science for Work community, visit us at ScienceForWork.com. A special thanks to our guest and to the entire Science for Work team. Science for Work is an independent, nonprofit foundation of evidence-based practitioners who want to make work better.